Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about Discipline Priest for M+, because there's been some changes both from a gameplay perspective, and I think that there's been a lot of community perception about Discipline being just utterly terrible, can't push high keys, blah blah blah, that I've kind of been hearing all week long, and I wanted to be able to kind of address now that there have been some more changes and adjustments to be able to really work with. And so for context, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus or anything like that, and I don't think that Discipline is the best healer that you're ever going to get in Mythic Plus. My recent video covering the tier list I think is still quite accurate, that Discipline's in a position where it can push high keys, but it's certainly on the lower end of that sort of ranking system, with Druid and Evoker at the top, Holy Paladin and Holy Priest in a stronger position, but I think Disc is probably still ahead of Mistweaver and Resto Shaman. That being said, I wanted to be able to reinforce that tier list that we had previously, and also just to be able to communicate my point of view, because I think a lot of people wanted additional context. Seeing Growl and Mode and a bunch of other people, saying this was bad or not really wanting to play it themselves, and I get that stuff, because when you're on beta, you want to be able to practice with your team, play whatever's going to be best, all that fun stuff. And I think that they also missed the adjustment in the build, and they didn't really have a lot of time to play with this Dark Discipline setup, and it's perfectly understandable, and I'll actually explain why as we go over the talents. One of the big things that changed with talents for Discipline is there was this odd period where Harsh Discipline in the bottom right-hand corner was not adjusted, but the rest of the kit was. So they increased that health of players, the damage of boss fights, and then Disc also got that Sins of the Many change, that 30% flat damage for a 5-man environment. But that change went in when Harsh Discipline still worked off atonement healing. So your atonement from penance was still really, really high. Then when everyone started making their tier lists, Harsh Discipline was adjusted to this 10 smite stuff, this garbage. And as a result, it very heavily affected how Discipline played in a 5-man environment. And as a result, you lost lots and lots of your atonement application as a result. So, coming around into this weekend, talking to other Disc Theory crafters like Reglitch was saying, why not run Shadow Covenant? Because you do have this 30% damage buff, because your shields are not quite cutting it anymore with things like Aegis of Wrath anymore. Try to push out the additional output you need out of Shadow Covenant. I also tried to Vamp Embrace, but Vamp Embrace is bad. So I gave it a try, and I did a couple different builds. This one is like a full darkness, inescapable torment, Shadow Covenant, Dark Reprimand, all that other fun stuff. I found that having Dark Reprimand, the Dark Penance, is really rough to be able to play around, not really because of the penance itself, but because you don't really have a lot of time to be able to cast your abilities, only a 7-second duration. Didn't really seem to work that well when M+ is just kind of all over the place. So I did not really like that, and Inescapable was just terrible damage, terrible atonement transfers as well, since it's only off of one enemy instead of the full 5 potential targets you can hit with it, so it didn't feel that satisfying to force procs out of it by using Shadow or Death even when I wasn't in execute phase. And the mana regen and the damage I was getting out of Bender wasn't really much better than just having Shadow Fiend. So today, when I was playing M+, I switched the builds around and started messing around with this setup where I'm keeping Blaze of Light and Wheel of Woe, and I'm dropping all of the Mindbender adjustments. I think this build is actually quite a lot better, and even though you're running Light's Wrath, which is mediocre, I think it's actually quite worth, because Blaze of Light and Wheel and Woe have very high value in and of themselves. Wheel and Woe, for example, is just great output and great boosts to your shields, guaranteeing basically every other powered shield is a 20% buff is really nice. It's almost the Aegis of Wrath effect, and Wheel and Woe is working with your force set, which is wonderful. And of course, you're just getting lots of damage coming out of Blaze of Light with Smite and Penance. I like this a lot, and I'm still undecided if I want to drop the new Harsh Discipline and go for like Borrowed Time uptime or something along those lines. I did actually mix around Enduring Luminescence, and the idea behind this was, with Pupil, you spend a lot of mana like reapplying your atonements, and it can be very costly to do so. Since mana is a frustration in this build, I thought it'd be a lot better to see if I could get additional value out of more worthwhile atonement application. Still kind of messing around with it, but that's the idea, at least that I was running with thus far. I do think that you always run with Embrace Shadow. I don't think that the Twilight Corruption value is quite high enough. And also, when you have a longer duration out of Shadow Covenant, you kind of have more uptime than Shadow abilities. So what you can do is you can actually Twilight Equilibrium Weave and mix in those Light Penances or even Light's Wrath as you need to be able to work off of the Twilight Equilibrium to also buff your Shadow spells during Shadow Covenant. Now, as we start breaking things down into the actual gameplay itself, again, I wanted to be able to talk about how this build kind of got missed a little bit, and missed as well by myself until now, until talking to other people about it, and I think that's why Disc gets a bit poorly rated, or much more poorly rated, I think, than it properly deserves. Some of the downsides for this build are absolutely mana, as you can burn a very hefty amount of it by hitting Mind Blast too frequently, by hitting Shadow Covenant too frequently, and it's almost like you have to let your allies bleed a little bit before you're going to be able to put together these sort of mini ramps onto your 5-man group. And so as a result, you need to be very conscious of the environment, where you need to be very preparatory of when you need to put up a lot of output for something like a Here's Your Storm, where you know when the damage is coming, you want to be able to kind of smooth the damage out in advance with some shields, make sure atonement's flowing or damage reduction is flowing onto everybody, so you have time to be able to have your Radiance out, then your Shadow Covenant, and then your Schism, and then back and forth between Twilight Equilibrium over the course of a Shadow Covenant duration. It will take time to be able to put together the full breadth of it. It's also pretty swingy, in particular on boss encounters, where once you get into execute phase and you have your double tap Shadow or Death, you can use that as like a massive cooldown. But again, they need to be in execute range. So you have to front load a lot of your cooldowns, your Rapture, your Barrier, individual pain supping somebody, things like that, to give you the breathing room so that you can get into that execute phase where things will be much easier to be able to deal with. Expiation, which increases your Shadow or Death damage, and Mind Blast damage, also consumes dots. This makes it even more important, as if it wasn't already, to continue to micromanage your dots and keep them flowing on a very hefty amount of targets, because you consume it to be able to deal damage, and you are going to be still getting mana out of Throes of Pain in your class tree to be able to fuel yourself. So I noticed a pretty substantial difference as well, having Innervate on hand. When we did Temple of the Jade Serpent, I had runs where we had like a Warlock with his Dispel Imp. That helped a massive amount as well. So there's a number of different areas that just by being able to save yourself some mana here and there, you feel a very tremendous difference very early on. And that's where some of the downside comes in, is that if you don't have access to the Innervate or you don't have extra assistance, you kind of have to lower your tempo a bit for some of these dungeons. And 100% to be fair, a lot of the best healers when it comes to Dragonflight Season 1 are going to be the ones that are the most mana efficient. So to reiterate again, I'm not trying to say that Discipline is going to be the new god of healers, but I do think that it has been unfairly criticized in terms of the tier lists that are out there, giving people the impression that it cannot do this high-end content. So that being said, I very, very thoroughly enjoy some of the different playstyle options that are really available to it, and I think in particular with some of the changes, or by aggressively using some of like the Innervate potions that they have, which kind of slow down your casts, but start making a lot of your abilities free. This can help substantially, especially if you're utilizing it in conjunction with like a Cancel Aura macro, to be able to hit that mana pot, to be able to get the discount on like Radiance or Shadow Coven, things like that, and then being able to cancel it after you get your most expensive abilities off in particular. I was finding, once again, there's still a decent amount of burst damage going on for these dungeons. I was also trying to limit test with, I did like a Spiteful Grievous run, which was a nightmare because you just could not drop combat. That was not fun. Disc still will have its struggles, obviously, during like Grievous, which is nothing new for the past 6-something years. But one of the strengths that it does have on hand is that The executes are great whenever you're in a trash pull that has a lot of priority targets, like the Mystics in the Halls of Valor, or an Algathar Academy when you have to kind of kill off those books. Whenever you have good presence of mind to be able to find those enemies that are drifting into Shadow or Death range, it allows you to lean much more heavily on your damage than any actual healing spells, which is something that we haven't really been able to do for a very long time. Previous iterations of Disc would rely on like Boon as their big atonement applicator, and that was about it. They would rely upon just Shadowman spam or just heavy multi-dotting to try to hope for some kind of output. Others would be relying on like your Boomkin to off heal, and I don't think that Disc is in any of those other positions at the moment. But there is that significant challenge of reining in that mana consumption and knowing how to properly rein in that mana consumption. That will be much more of a challenge. I'm still really confused as to why Inescapable Torment is just a garbage ability. That one, more than anything else, I think should be more properly generating 5 atonement onto allies, or should actually have some better mana return as well. Even Shadow Fiend as well seemed very pithy in terms of the mana regen that it was coming around. And so those things were very noticeable as I was playing through this build. And it was also really easy to kind of like overstack cooldowns or stress over how I wanted to use things like Mind Games, or in particular whether I wanted to burn Schism just for damage or if I wanted to be able to hold on to it for a while. I did find that once I got comfortable, it was a lot about momentum. Being able to cleave down enemies and being able to focus down enemies so that you can have Shadow or Death was really valuable. But also, if you're having wipes or mistakes, trying to get back into that flow can kind of take a lot of time. Also, some bosses are pretty good with like Temple of the Jade Serpent as an example that force the RP for a healer so you have the time to drink. But I definitely know that when you're getting into, 21s, 22s, the 0.1% type of keys, you really will not have all the time in the world to be able to min-max your mana. So proper use of your consumables, or hoping that we start getting some more mana nerfs coming into the picture, will be very important. But like I said before, I do fully expect this to be able to push into those 19s, 20s. I believe it's 18s is the max loot that you get from like end of dungeon vault, whereas 20s is the end of... What is it? 20s is like the end of... it's for your vaults to be able to upgrade your gear as best as you possibly can. So I have been a very big fan of this Shadow Covenant build and the Shadow-oriented setup, mixing it with Twilight Equilibrium to cast your Radiance, hit your Shadow Covenant, Schism, followed up by Penance into usually your Mind Blast or a Shadow or Death if you have it. Light's Wrath was very clunky to be able to mix in because of the lengthy cast time, but being able to weave it in as time permitted did seem to be pretty good. There were also still some kind of like dead talents. I tried the increased duration for Schism. Like I mentioned before, I tried mixing in Vamp and Brace. I did get pretty good uptime out of like Words of the Pious, which is more smite damage that you're getting once you cast shields. I got pretty good uptime out of those, but overall, I do think that there's a little bit missing to further propel Disc in a powerful area for a 5-man environment, and I just gotta be able to just do a little bit more testing to be able to properly nail down where it's at. But that said, like I mentioned before, I do think Druid, Evoker, Holy Pally, Holy Priest are in stronger spots than Disc. I think there's more work required, but I do not think that Disc is in some terrible position as advertised, and I would very heavily encourage some people to give this build a shot, see how they enjoy it, and see where it takes you. Otherwise, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it, found it useful, and I'll catch you all next time.